The Addiction Podcast, Point of No Return.
Hello, I'm Joni Siegel, the host of the Addiction Podcast. In 2022, over 100,000 people died from drug and alcohol abuse, and that number is growing daily. Fentanyl poisoning, pot, cocaine, heroin, and even psychedelics and alcohol all contribute to this crisis, while we're bombarded with promotions from thousands of rehabs. Newborns are born addicted, and the majority of homeless people struggle with drug addiction. Drug dealers exploit online resources to sell to teens, and antidepressant use is spiraling out of control. This podcast features brutally honest guest interviews revealing harsh realities and offering hope and solutions through their stories. We don't sugarcoat anything. Guests speak raw and real. More importantly, you'll find inspiration to understand, overcome, and achieve recovery, whether for yourself or to help others, some within your own family, many among your friends or associates. Whether you're seeking help or just a glimmer of hope, our podcast equips you with the latest insights to confront this generational battle. Many listeners tell us they want to join the fight, but do not have the time or money to act, lobby, or just help. If that's you, go to www.patreon.com/theaddictionpodcast and see how you can help. Barry Meier, thank you so much for being willing to talk to us today on the podcast. I know it's an extremely busy time for you, and we will get to why that is, but I appreciate you being with us today.
Joni, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Barry, how did you get into investigative reporting? Give us just a little bit of background on you.
I stumbled onto documents showing that Dow Chemical, one of the biggest chemical companies in the country, which made the chemical defoliant Agent Orange during the Vietnam War, had dumped Agent Orange into the water supply of the town in Michigan where the company was based.
Hi, my name is Amy Newman, and my husband Bobby and I have a business called Newman Intervention Services. We provide intervention services for families who have loved ones struggling with drug addiction. Our goal is to help individuals get the support and treatment they need to overcome addiction and start on the path to recovery. With our personalized and compassionate approach, we guide families through the challenging process of getting their loved one into rehab and onto a road of a healthier future. Together, we can make a positive difference in the lives of those affected by drugs. If you or someone you know is in need of an intervention, don't hesitate to reach out to us. Let's work together and bring hope and healing to those battling addiction.
Call 866-989-4499 today and say the word podcast to get a 10% discount. Or go to newmaninterventions.com and type in the word podcast for a 10% discount. This service comes with a free 1-hour consultation with Bobby.
And I wrote a story about this, and they flipped out. And they flew in their top executives to Manhattan. They came to the offices of Chemical Week, and they expected the editor of this magazine to fire me on the spot, which to his credit, he didn't. He was very supportive. He was a good guy. And the upshot was that the Wall Street Journal was looking for someone to cover the chemical industry. Someone there saw my articles about Dow Chemical, and they hired me. And so here I was, a college dropout who hadn't had any professional training in journalism, being hired by one of the biggest newspapers in the country. And somehow,
Barry, can I just ask you, because I'm listening to you tell the story, and I'm like, okay, I'm not going to say it that way. How did you have the guts to write something like that? I mean, you are now writing about one of the biggest chemical corporations in the country. I mean,
I don't know. I guess you could basically say I had a bad attitude.
Okay, all
Maybe
right.
I would subscribe to that way. I didn't care. I felt, that there was an injustice
Yeah.
that was being done. And throughout what would become a very long reporting career, I was always motivated and stirred by injustices. I remember a colleague at the Wall Street Journal coming to me and saying to me, Barry, you are the kind of reporter that will always do stories about the little guy that's getting hurt. And I said, yeah, that's right. And so I became a reporter at the Wall Street Journal. I managed to learn how to write newspaper articles essentially by the seat of my pants. I almost got fired several times. And I was naturally drawn to investigative reporting and started doing stories like that for the Journal. I then was subsequently hired by a newspaper here in New York called New York Newsday to be an investigative reporter for them. And that was very brief because in 1989, I got a call out of the blue from an editor at the New York Times who told me that, Barry, we've seen your work. We'd like you to come in for an interview. And I was hired by the Times.
Wow.
And that would be the beginning of what was essentially a 30-year-long career at the New York Times.
Well,
So I've been very lucky.
Let me just say, sorry, editorial comment. I mean, thank you for having the guts to stand up to some of these powers, if you will, and tell the story that needs to be told. Not, as you know, not everyone has the chutzpah to do that. So thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
You are listening to the Addiction Podcast, Point of No Return. For more information on the podcast or to reach out if you have a story you would like to share with us, go to our Facebook page by the same name, or you can email us at theaddictionpodcast@yahoo.com, or go to our website, theaddictionpodcast.com. And please remember to subscribe to our podcast wherever you listen to podcasts and give us a 5-star review. We appreciate you listening to the Addiction Podcast, Point of No Return. We don't do this podcast because we are former addicts. We don't do this podcast because we have loved ones who have suffered from addiction. We do this podcast because we feel that addiction is one of the biggest problems facing the world today, and that no matter who you are, no matter your religion, no matter your income status, no matter your race, no matter anything about you, addiction affects you. This podcast is a free resource for anybody looking for help with it.
So I'm doing any number of stories at the Times, and I was in the late 90s. I was asked to cover all the tobacco litigation that was being brought, all the litigation that was being brought by the states against the tobacco industry. So I did that for about 2 years or so. That kind of ended. And in 2001, I was sitting at my desk, kind of happily minding my own business, waiting, I guess, for the clock to hit 4 or 5 so I could go home. And an editor came up to me, a guy who was a friend of mine, and a very good investigative reporter himself. And he said to me, I just got a call from a friend of mine who's on the pharmacy board in Ohio or some Midwestern state, who said to me, there's this new hot drug on the street. It's called OxyContin. And the strange thing about it is that all the drug reps for its producer are going around and telling doctors and pharmacists that it's kind of a wonder drug. It's that it's got this special coating that makes it virtually impossible to be abused, and patients won't get addicted to it. And that was the first time that I'd ever heard about OxyContin, its manufacturer, Purdue Pharma, or the owners of Purdue, the Sackler family. And at that time, I knew nothing about the pharmaceutical industry, about, prescription narcotics or opioids, as they were called, became to be called, about drug addiction. I had a clue about what was going on, but I'd follow the story. And in time, it took me down. It turned out that the tip we got was right, that this company was promoting this drug in a way that wasn't true, that dozens of people were starting to overdose from it. And there were hot spots in these various places like Western Virginia, Maine, Florida, Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, that doctors were starting to set up pill mills to sell OxyContin prescriptions for cash. And I started writing stories about it through 2001. I got a call from a Purdue insider who met me and gave me a list showing all the top selling sales reps, the toppers, as they call them,
Wow.
in the country, and where their sales districts were. And this person said to me, if you look at these districts, every one of them, there's a pill mill that these sales reps were servicing. And it became very clear to me that Purdue Pharma knew what was going on, that they were turning a blind eye to what was going on.
Wow.
So I just kept writing through 2001, writing story after story, maybe a dozen of them that year for the Times. And then I left and I started working on the book, Painkiller. And I set that book in this small town in Western Virginia, the western part of Virginia called Pennington Gap, where there was a doctor, Art Van Zee, his wife, a nun, Sister Beth, and a group of people who were trying to sound the alarm about the predatory practices of Purdue, the damage that OxyContin was doing. And I used their story to chronicle what was becoming the biggest prescription drug disaster of our times.
Wow. Well, so this was in the early 2000s.
Correct. The book came out in 2003, I'm sorry.
And it's amazing to me how many people didn't know about it at that time.
Correct. Yes,
I know we had no idea until we started the podcast, which was in late 2017, and no idea of this whole OxyContin epidemic or any of that. And I think that the general public was in the same boat.
It's absolutely true. I mean, the book, A Painkiller, which I thought was important, I was hoping would sound an alarm bell, went out of print after a year. It sold so few copies because no one was interested in this subject. They thought it was just an issue that maybe was affecting a few people in some small towns that they had never heard about and would never pass through.
Wow.
You are listening to the Addiction Podcast, Point of No Return. For more information on the podcast or to reach out if you have a story you would like to share with us, go to our Facebook page by the same name, or you can email us at theaddictionpodcast@yahoo.com, or go to our website, theaddictionpodcast.com. And please remember to subscribe to our podcast wherever you listen to podcasts and give us a 5-star review.
And over the next 15 years, as this epidemic grew and grew, and, the number of overdose deaths climb from the dozens annually into the hundreds, into the thousands, into 10 or 15,000 annually. During that entire time, people who we expect to protect us, lawmakers and regulators and professional medical organizations, either were co-opted, were corrupted, or were cowered into doing nothing, while the pharmaceutical industry downplayed this carnage. And it was just shocking and stunning for me to see.
Yep. Again, thank you for having the courage to stand up against a monster, if you will, like Purdue Pharma that was that big, and the pharmaceutical industry. Because, yeah. Thank you for doing that. Has the book been republished now?
It has.
Okay.
I'm very happy to say it's come out in a new paperback version in connection with the Netflix series, and it's in my mind, it's a great, exciting, easy read. Most people read it, they say, I got hooked. I read it in a day. I read it in a day and a half. And I think what it does, and I know there have been lots of other books and articles written about this, but when you read this book, you're seeing it essentially through the eyes of someone as it's happening, as this tragedy is beginning, and the forces that are creating it.
It's a horrifying story. And what I think makes it even, if it were just fiction, if it were just something that you had made up, okay, it would be a horrifying story. The fact that it's true takes it to a whole other level that is, horrifying to the max. How did the Netflix series come about? How did that come about, Barry?
Sure. Well, the book had sort of a long journey from the page to the screen. It was originally optioned when it came out, but at that time, again, Purdue Pharma hadn't been found guilty of the crimes that I had sketched out in the book. So, Hollywood said, well, we love the story, but are they bad people? Or are they good people? They haven't been convicted of anything as yet. So they were kind of like going, well, we're not ready to go there. And then in 2017, right around the time you started this podcast, the story started changing. There was a whole new level of attention brought to it. The states began a new series of lawsuits against Purdue and the Sackler family. And I was contacted by two screenwriters, Micah Fitzgerald and Noah Harpster, who had been writers on the show Transparent and were doing television series as well. And they loved the book. They wanted to do something with it. I went, go with God, guys, but it turned out that, as is often the case, its time had finally come. And it bounced around for a while, first at Amazon, then it went to Netflix, where it was sort of joined together with a story that Patrick Radden Keith had written for The New Yorker about the Sackler family. And it found its way to Eric Newman, who was the executive producer of Narcos. And he brought it into Netflix, and they greenlit it.
That's
and then
awesome.
It was several years, between the time it was shot and today.
Wow. It's a series that everybody needs to watch. I think so often, and I've talked about this on the podcast before, people think that just because they don't have a family member that's addicted or that has suffered from addiction, or they themselves have not suffered from addiction, that this problem and this situation and this story doesn't affect them. But it's just not true. It affects every single person in this country, if not the world, and everybody.
Everyone knows about, everyone's heard about, everyone has preconceptions about, they've made assumptions about. And I think one of the things that the show does, and I'm very grateful for how it does it, is that you realize, even if you think you know a lot about this subject, oh, I read about this, I don't really need to see a show about this. It sort of dispels all those preconceptions.
Mm-hmm.
And you start seeing all of this through fresh eyes. And I think that's extremely important too, to understand this in a way that's, that's not bound up in what your preconceptions are.
I completely agree. And having watched as much of it as I have, it's extremely hard hitting, and it needs to be hard hitting because, as I say, people just, they cannot necessarily confront, the evil involved in the Purdue company and the Sackler family. And it's something that people need to see. They need to know.
Well,
sorry, go ahead.
From the start, I was, the decisions that were made in the show by Eric Newman, the producer, and Peter Berg, the director, some of them were revelations to me. Like, normally at the start of a show like this, that's a dramatization of a real story, you'll have a disclaimer that will say something like, this is dramatic, real telling of a story, none of the characters depicted are real, and blah, 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 sort of like, well, you don't have to take this really seriously, folks, because we've sort of made it up. But as you've seen, this show starts with something very real, which are the parents of children, are the parents who have had children lost to this, whose children were prescribed these drugs by doctors, by people whom they trusted, and the tragic consequences that ensued. And I think that sets a tone and a seriousness that is inescapable.
I agree. Barry, was there anything while you wrote this story that, I don't want to say you're a hardened investigative reporter, but you've looked into very controversial and, nasty situations. Was there anything in this one that surprised you?
I would say that there is practically nothing in this that didn't surprise me. I grew up believing that I revered doctors. I still revere doctors, but I believe that doctors were like the bedrock of our society. They were people into whom we could place our trust, that they would always act in our benefit. And, when I started researching the Sackler family and researching Arthur Sackler, Dr. Arthur Sackler, who was basically the patriarch of the Sackler family, and who in the 1950s and 1960s essentially created a whole new industry which was the advertising of prescription drugs. Before Arthur Sackler, drugs were not promoted by drug companies to doctors. There was sort of a wall there. And Arthur Sackler created all these madman style advertising and promotional techniques, like paying doctors to be pitchmen for drug companies, planting fake news stories about the wonders of drugs, starting magazines that wrote glowing reports about drug companies that were sponsors of the magazines, corrupting and co-opting FDA officials. I mean, you name it, it all traces back to Arthur Sackler. And what I found so extraordinary is that all these techniques that were pioneered by Arthur Sackler, and who died in 1987 before the first tablet of OxyContin was ever sold, would be utilized by his brothers, Arthur and Mortimer, and other members of his families, including his nephew, Richard Sackler, who ran Purdue during OxyContin's boom years, to promote what arguably was the most powerful and potentially addicting narcotic ever marketed by the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, essentially, Purdue used techniques to market OxyContin that other companies used to promote, like a diuretic or, a heart, high blood pressure medication. They gave away hats to doctors. They gave away plushy pills to doctors, T-shirts, CDs, get into the swing, where old people were dancing again because of OxyContin. And they turned a drug that was extremely valuable in very limited situations, like, the treatment of cancer pain or serious ongoing chronic pain. They realized in order to make billions, they had to pitch this drug as good for every kind of pain, be it back pain, dental pain, sports injury pain, you name it.
Yep. Heavy duty. I mean, heavy duty. Their marketing techniques are like no others.
They were masters at it.
Absolutely.
But the consequences of it were absolutely disastrous.
Well, they were marketing addiction and they were marketing death.
Well, they, as I discovered in my investigation, they knew, right? I found information showing that they knew, one, that the claim that, OxyContin's slow release formula would, reduce its abuse wasn't true. And two, that the abuse of the drug took place almost immediately. And, one of the most shocking things to me was, in 2017, 10 years after the Justice Department settled its case against Purdue, I was given a memo, a 120-page memo that was written by the prosecutors in Virginia, who brought the case against the company and its executives, and who wanted to charge those executives with serious felonies, crimes that would, if convicted, would send them to jail. And I thought I knew a lot about this story. And when I looked at this document, I was completely stunned by, the evidence that suggested the level of deception that was going on, the level of contempt for doctors that Purdue had, and even the level of disregard for the people who they claimed they were championing, pain patients. Now, maybe in court, Purdue would have, turned this around and shot down all these allegations that prosecutors were prepared to make. But I really believe that if this case had gone forward and this evidence had seen the light of day in 2007, that sort of the trajectory of the opioid epidemic could have been blunted and bent.
That's a very, very valid point you make. And I agree with you completely. So the Netflix series is out on the 10th of August?
Yes, it starts on Thursday,
Okay.
August 10th. It's 6 hour-long episodes. It has a fabulous cast, including Matthew Broderick, who plays Richard Sackler. In other words, a guy who you automatically associate with nice people like Ferris Bueller, playing someone who's not so nice.
Yep.
And Uzo Abudu, who plays a composite character who serves as the investigator, who realizes something is going on here and I need to find out what's happening.
And Taylor Kitsch as well.
And Taylor Kitsch. Let's not forget Taylor,
Yep.
who is excellent
Yep.
as Glenn, the mechanic who has an accident and becomes addicted to Oxy.
Right. Well, thank you for what you do. Thank you for what you've done. Thank you for shedding the light on this story. It cannot be talked about enough. It cannot be promoted enough. And we will continue to promote it. And this Thursday, today is the 8th, 2 days from now, on Netflix. Y'all need to watch this series.
Yes. And so, yes. And, thank you for having me on. I would encourage your listeners to watch the show, read the book, and understand how this happened and why we have to make sure it never happens again.
Exactly. And I'm assuming the book is on Amazon.
It is, most definitely.
Barry, I cannot thank you enough for talking to us today. I know that you are super busy with interviews. Thank you.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. The book is Painkiller by Barry Meier, Meier, and the series is on Netflix starting this evening, starring Matthew Broderick, Matthew Broderick, Uzo Aduba, and Taylor Kitsch, among others. This is a story that needs to be told. I know that there's a lot of attention on fentanyl right now, but this is still a valid story that everybody needs to know about. It's amazing how many people don't know about it. This is a very hard-hitting series. This is not for your children. Be prepared. And we'll be back again with another interview next week.
You have been listening to the Addiction Podcast, Point of No Return. For more information, reach out to us on Facebook or go to www.theaddictionpodcast.com. Our email is theaddictionpodcast@yahoo.com.